What do we know about the inner elite so far? We know their philosophy of ruling comes from Aristotle. We know that in the 1600s, the Black Guelph of Hanover and the House of Orange joined forces, and with the help of the powerful Protestant leaders and banking elites, they seized control of the British monarchy. From that point on, they built a wall of secrecy behind the British Parliament and have ruled from the shadows ever since. Their tentacles into other nations, the intelligence agencies, born, raised, and educated to carry out their bidding. The inner elites guard one secret above all others: how society is ruled. They pass the rules of the game down from generation to generation. In their world, life isn't lived, it's played. Welcome back to Decoded. We're breaking down the part titled The Secret Knowledge. It starts off by stating, they're not just running spies, they're running a cult of knowledge, a closed club of elite minds, forged in the halls of Oxford and Cambridge, where they learn to interpret the classics and twist their practical implications. What Oxford and Cambridge know and what they admit publicly are two very different things. To show how they've corrupted language, LaRouche points us back to Anaximander of Miletus. He described air as the primal force of existence. Sounds simple, right? Nothing unusual, nothing to see here. The Greek word he used doesn't just mean air. It's closer to the German word Geist, meaning mind or spirit, depending on the context. But according to LaRouche, this meaning has been buried, and the fraud keeps going because PhDs keep parroting the mistranslation. LaRouche dares the reader to crack open a textbook and see the distortion for themselves. When it comes to understanding the ancient world, forget the official readings. Those secondary sources, they're not history, they're frauds. And worse, they're frauds repeated by the naive. This isn't carelessness, it's a strategy. Oxford and Cambridge have twisted language and rewritten history. Not to keep us safe, not for truth, but for one thing: advantage. They've locked away the real story, the most vital parts of history, and turned it into the secret knowledge for the elites, giving the public safe, sterile mythologies dressed up as education. They get the roadmap, we get the fairy tales. But once you know this fraud exists, you can start to look further afield. The secret knowledge is out there, in old manuscripts, in scattered fragments, in places they thought you would never look. Sure, some of it is locked away in vaults, but there's enough left in the open, LaRouche says, to rebuild the truth if you know how to look. It's the same trick as the purloined letter. The thing you seek is hidden in plain sight. The problem is, without the right eyes, you'll walk past it 1,000 times and never see it. Through this system, Britain and its allies have controlled much of the world for centuries. We're not just pulling dates out of thin air. There's a reason we focus on the 7th to 4th century BC. That's when the core ideas were forged, the ones that still shape the elite power structures. If you can grasp the key issues of that era and see how they set the course for everything after, then you've uncovered the greatest secret of all: because beyond that, there is no bigger mystery left. Not about the past and not about the present. One example LaRouche points to is the case of the Jewish religion, which he describes as an influential hoax. He argues it didn't originate with Solomon or in earlier times, but was created centuries later as an artificial cult, pieced together by the Babylonians and others.
What LaRouche is saying here is that the foundation of the Jewish religion wasn't purely divine revelation or tradition, but a patchwork, a mix of Mesopotamian myths, political propaganda against rivals like the Phoenicians and Egyptians, and scraps of real Babylonian history. That last part is important. By slipping in just enough truth, the story became believable. LaRouche labels this a Mesopotamian hoax, rewritten again and again, and he argues always overseen by outsiders. According to him, that process is what shaped the Old Testament into the form we recognize today.
LaRouche says this hoax first appeared in European languages around 230 BC. He claims it was promoted by the Aristotelian philosophers, the Peripatetics, following orders from the Ptolemaic rulers.
The Peripatetics were the followers of Aristotle. Their name comes from the Greek word peripatos, meaning to walk around, because Aristotle often taught his students while pacing through the Lyceum in Athens. After his death, they carried on his philosophy, focusing on observation, logic, and the belief that hierarchy and order are natural parts of the world. Think of them as the original Aristotelian fan club, the group that kept his ideas alive and passed them down to later elites. Now, fast forward a few centuries to Egypt under the Ptolemies. This dynasty of Macedonian Greeks took control after Alexander the Great's death, ruling from about 305 to 30 BC. They weren't native Egyptians, but they secured power by blending Greek and Egyptian traditions. Religion was their favorite tool. They created hybrid cults designed to unify their diverse subjects, like the cult of Serapis, a brand new god stitched together from Greek and Egyptian deities, and the reshaped worship of Isis and Osiris, tailored to appeal across cultures. The most famous of these rulers was Cleopatra VII, the last of the line, who tried to preserve Egypt's independence before Rome swallowed it whole. So when you hear Ptolemaic rulers, picture Greek kings and queens running Egypt, using a careful mix of politics, culture, and religion to keep control.
Later, Philo of Alexandria tried to create a Platonic-style version of Judaism, but instead of throwing out the existing text, which would have been politically dangerous, he kept them and gave them a very different meaning.
Thomas Aquinas, 1225 to 1274, was a Catholic priest and philosopher, considered one of the greatest minds of the Middle Ages. His most famous work, the Summa Theologica, tried to blend Christian theology with Aristotle's philosophy, creating a system of thought that shaped Catholic teaching for centuries. According to tradition, near the end of his life Aquinas had a mystical experience that made him say all his writings seemed like straw, compared to what he had seen. Some interpret this as him realizing his earlier work had missed the mark. That's why LaRouche mentions him here, to suggest that even the Church's greatest intellectual defender of Aristotle eventually turned away from it.
LaRouche also claims the early Christian apostles faced a similar problem with the Old Testament. He says they dealt with it by focusing on the dispensation of Christ, meaning the new covenant, the new era in which Christ freed humanity from the strict laws of the Old Testament and replaced them with faith and peace. Only the passages that pointed to the coming of the Messiah or that fit with Christianity were treated as important. This doesn't mean that apostles were hoaxers like the Aristotelians. LaRouche says apostolic Christians always saw Aristotelianism as a force for evil, a view later shared by some of the greatest religious thinkers of the European Renaissance. LaRouche also claims that Thomas Aquinas eventually joined this line of thinking. LaRouche says the early Christian church was always Platonic or Neoplatonic in its outlook. Aristotelian ideas only slipped in later through the lingering influence of the Apollo cult. As the Roman Empire collapsed, Christianity was reshaped into an official state religion, one designed to fit pagan Aristotelian-style policies for controlling society through religion. He admits the church doesn't put it so bluntly, but he argues some theologians, including Cardinal Nicholas of Cusa, were very open about the problems with Aristotelianism.
Nicholas of Cusa, 1401 to 1464, was a German philosopher, mathematician, and Catholic cardinal. He's remembered as one of the most original thinkers of the Renaissance. Cusa challenged rigid Aristotelian ways of thinking. Instead, he emphasized the limits of human knowledge and introduced the idea of learned ignorance. The belief that true wisdom comes from recognizing that we can't fully grasp the infinite nature of God or the universe. LaRouche highlights him because Cusa openly criticized Aristotelianism and saw it as a barrier to deeper spiritual and philosophical understanding. So when you hear his name, think of him as a Renaissance bridge builder, a church leader who tried to move Christian thought away from Aristotle's logic and closer to a Platonic, more mystical outlook.
Still, most agreed it was better to let the faithful remain naive than risk shattering their beliefs. Both Platonists and Aristotelians believe in using myths to guide the masses, but for very different reasons. To see the difference, you have to look at the Platonic method, which divides the human mind into 3 levels. The first and lowest is simple belief, where people accept myths, prejudice, and so-called common sense without ever questioning them. Platonists knew all myths were false, but they also believed no one could rise above them without reason. So when dealing with people at the lower levels of understanding, they used myth as a tool. The key was separating the myths that pushed society forward from the ones that dragged it down. The second level is mere understanding, where people recognize patterns and cause and effect, almost like basic scientific knowledge, but they don't know why those laws exist, only how to use them. The philosopher Spinoza called these first 2 levels fictitious. The third and highest level is reason. It's the pursuit of truth itself. Here, people rise above myth and surface level understanding and begin to grasp the principles that shape reality.
Here's a modern-day interruption of these levels. That first level, simple belief, is like scrolling social media and taking every meme or headline at face value. No questions asked. The second level, mere understanding, is when you've learned enough to see the patterns. You know how things work in practice, but you can't explain the deeper why behind them. And then there's the third level, reason. That's when you stop accepting surface appearances and start digging for principles. Not just what works, but what's true. Plato's point? Most people live and die in the first 2 levels. Only a few ever climb to reason.
Throughout history, theologians have struggled to reconcile truth and reason when shaping their beliefs and policies. While the ultimate goal was to bring all people to reason, atonement, they had to work within the limits set by the simple beliefs of the ignorant. The Aristotelians, on the other hand, and their successors, Bernard of Clairvaux, Martin Luther, and Presbyterian leaders, have long pursued policies that oppose knowledge and science. According to LaRouche, the Aristotelians were the first true intelligence network for the oligarchies, serving both Philip of Macedon's court and the Parisian Empire. Their role was to stop progress, to shut down science and replace it with manufactured myths that kept people trapped in blind belief. LaRouche argues the goal was nothing less than a permanent world ruled by the elite landowners. To get there, they had to weaken cities, tie society to the countryside, and enforce anti-technology zero-growth policies, which he called a Malthusian agenda against progress. And in his view, that same method still drives policy today. Before we end this episode, I want to confess my own ignorance when it comes to history. Until I read this document, I had very little interest in history and zero interest in philosophy. My thinking was simple. As long as we learn from the past and evolved as a species towards a better world, who cares what happened centuries ago? Especially in a time I can barely comprehend. Turns out I couldn't have been more wrong. What I thought didn't matter is actually what matters most, if you want to know the truth. In fact, that's exactly what the elites want us to think. They don't want us to burden our so-called feeble minds with history. They want us to swallow the surface-level details they feed us and keep playing detective in a rigged game, knowing most people will never break the surface. In the last section, the Aristotelian enemies of mankind, we learnt that the devil was in the details and not to get buried there. Details distract. Instead, look at the patterns. In this section, we've seen the history of their philosophy and how it still drives their agenda today. So I want you to think about this time in history, when you look past the details, past the noise, at what's really going on in the world today. What patterns do you see? Do you see leaders whose actions match their words? Governments saying one thing to our face and doing the complete opposite in policy? When I look at Australia, I can see no other reason for what's happening. We're in the middle of a housing crisis. Homelessness is climbing to levels most of us have never seen in our lifetime. Families, kids, and people with jobs that should be able to afford a home are living in tents in public parks. And yet the government is bringing in 150,000 immigrants a day. Last week, the media reported 100 applicants competing for one house in Western Australia. Why would any government do that? It's certainly not good policy, and it's barely humane. These policies aren't compassion. They're about importing poverty. They're about shifting wealth away from the middle class. Yes, Australia has always had a homeless population. Every nation does. But when the crisis explodes because of government choices that ignore the most basic laws of supply and demand, it's no accident. It's a deliberate importation of third world slums. Now, it's easy to blame this clown, but that is ignorance. The facts of the patterns are this. The Australian government isn't really running this country. It's a facade, just like the British Parliament. The real power is the ruling European elites, and they're steering us towards global feudalism. I hate to serve up a depresso espresso and run, so let me leave you with the antidote, something to carry with you so you can leave this episode feeling empowered to take action. Their great philosophy, their guiding star, their centuries-old playbook, it never accounted for the technology we have today. For centuries, they have controlled truth and information. But now, most of these elites are boomers, relics of another era. They don't understand the world we're living in. They're still clinging to an old script that is fast becoming obsolete. Meanwhile, we hold in our hand a weapon of mass communication. Information has never spread so freely, so fiercely, so far beyond their control. Their grip is slipping, and they're struggling to regain control. Their biggest miscalculation, believing we were nothing more than dumb cattle. But we are running out of time. This isn't about war in the streets. It's about smart, calculated action, the kind that hit them where it hurts the most, their financial system. These people are addicts, no different from the junkie on the street. They are addicted to zeros. More than anything, they need to see the numbers on the spreadsheets or screens climb higher and higher. Their drug is money. Do you see it yet? Do you see the truth hidden in plain sight? They may print the money, but we, the many, hold the power. We, the many, control the flow of the money. We choose where and how to spend it. The one who controls the drug owns the addict. For now, that is us. But it won't be for long. Why do you think they're pushing for a central bank digital currency? Because that is how they plan to control the flow of money. Control the flow, you hold the power. They know it's our greatest weapon, and they fear the day we wake up and wield it against them. Because on that day, the addicts won't own us.